Hello and welcome. For anyone who doesn't already know me, my name is Ravi, and I'm a new parent of a wonderful little boy named Ari. And previously, I've spent a lot of time studying education and cognitive psychology and linguistics, and looking at just various forms of educational media. And as a new parent, I've been going through all of my old favorite books about children's education and child development research, and trying to make some notes for myself about how I want to raise my new son. And in that process, there was a couple of books that really stood out to me as especially important, and one in particular that I just really wanted to learn everything I possibly could from and make sure I'm applying it. And that's Mind in the Making by Ellen Galinsky. And so, as part of that process, I thought I'd share my notes here for anyone else who's looking for a summary of this book or thoughts on how the research within it can help inform parents looking at the best ways to educate and raise their children and the best ways to interact with them. So, at the heart of this book, there's seven categories that the author suggests that we should think of as the core skills that are at the foundation of our children's cognitive development. And those are focus and attention, perspective taking, communication, making connections, which really has a lot to do with creativity, critical thinking, taking on challenges, and self-directed learning. So one reaction after seeing a list like this might be to say, like, okay, so this looks lovely and all, but why is it worth me investing all the time it takes to go through a full book and slog through all the research about these particular items? Especially like if all the items on this list already sound good to me, then why do I need to go deeper than that? So, before getting into the seven skills from this book, let's first take a step back and think about just how categorization actually affects our parenting practices in concrete terms. Right? I'm guessing 100% of the people watching this video are already familiar with the idea of a school report card, where a kid, let's call this one little Timmy, might come home with categories and saying things like, hey, I got an A in history and an A in science, but I got a C in mathematics and a D in English. And based on this categorization breakdown, parents might then reach decisions like saying, like, okay, little Timmy, we looked at your report card and we decided now we're going to allocate more of your study time to studying English literature, and we're going to hire you a tutor who's specialized in this field. So far, all of this presumably sounds pretty familiar. But let's imagine what we'd do if we had a more nuanced categorization in that report card. What decisions would we make if, like, the report card for little Timmy came back with something like this, like saying, hey, Timmy is great at thinking logically, and he has a strong interest and understanding of history, and he loves physics and can understand the motion of natural objects really well. He's not so great at writing essays or expressing his thoughts. He has no interest in classical literature, and he struggles with abstract numbers and quantities. So when we categorize the skills this way, we're more likely to then say something like, oh, it doesn't make sense for Timmy to have to learn both essay writing and literature, like two things he struggles with and dislikes at the same time. Like, let's first like help him write essays about history, which he's actually interested in. And once he's mastered that skill, then he can tackle English literature separately. Or we might say something like, hey, let's leverage his interest in physics to first develop his sense of numbers and quantities, and then we'll work on doing abstract mathematics later. Right, so there's no shortage of other examples and case studies out there I could have pulled where basically a lot of cases where students who focus in excelling in one subject then suddenly become like far more capable and quickly able to master another seemingly separate subject that they struggled with previously because they got some skills from a different subject. In fact, following the lead of schools in Norway that have been moving away from kind of report cards like this since really the 1970s, some entire cities in Finland have followed suit and are doing away with categorization, the typical way we think of it. And it's really becoming a common wish amongst researchers that who get to design schools from the ground up to kind of rethink these kind of things. So anyway, that's just one example of the way in which we choose to categorize our goals can end up having like, real world impacts on how we see our options and the decisions we make as parents. So with these seven categories, each of the cognitive skills in this book have had just an enormous trove of research and careful thought underpinning the decisions to pick these particular skills versus others, and a lot of thought into why they in particular merit our focus. So ultimately, having these seven as they can become like a really useful checklist for us to reflect upon when we're trying to decide if all the activities in our kids' lives are ones that are like balanced and optimal, or if we should be making kind of subtle modifications to their activities in order to better enrich their lives. So with that, let's dive into each of the seven skills. So the first skill is focus and self-control. And the author makes a lot of compelling arguments about why this is the most foundational and primary skill underlying all the rest of a child's education. For example, she argues how even if your ultimate goal is to have a kid who's excellent at mathematics, you have a choice, like you could decide that you're going to focus directly on teaching that kid mathematics skills, or you could choose to teach them just better focus and concentration skills. And that, in and of itself, will then result in them ultimately having as good mathematics scores as if you had just focused on mathematics, as well as improvements in virtually every other discipline and other aspects of their life, even things like their temperament. So that may sound a bit hard to believe at first, but she does a great job reviewing all the research that leads her to that conclusion and explaining why that is. Or another reaction, you might think like, hey, I already believe that focus, attention, and self-control are all just super important. Like, why should I spend hours reading her book and listening to all the research when, hey, I already believe that? So the first challenge with this topic is that people have all sorts of notions about what focus or self-control actually are. And while most people wouldn't disagree with the definitions that the author discusses in these topics, she's really careful to only use the definitions for these topics that have extensive research and thought underpinning them. She's very careful to exclude a lot of the common misconceptions about these topics and begins the chapter with a really well-researched definition of each of them. For example, a lot of people often associate these topics, like focus, self-control, with a degree of passivity. Like there's a common notion that if you want to develop focus and self-control in a kid, you should focus on getting them used to kind of lots of restrictions and emptying their mind, being accustomed to like this very passive way of being. But the research presented by the author ultimately builds up kind of a very active model of training focus and self-control in kids. And with that, she moves the focus away from restricting and quieting kids, instead to recognizing how actively educating them in self-control we are when we're doing things like we're playing just games with them, like Simon Says or Red Light, Green Light with kids. And so it's possible when you saw the graphic that's on the screen that you were a little confused why I picked this graphic while I'm talking about the importance of developing focus and self-control and attention. Maybe like you subconsciously thought I was going to start with this graphic to show kids that are distracted and unfocused, and then I was going to switch to a graphic of like a kid quietly studying or meditating. But this graphic here showing kids that are happy and excited and playing Simon Says together actually captures what we should be thinking about when we talk about developing self-control in children. And the author does an excellent job explaining just why that is and all the research to underpin it. Because when you're playing games like Simon Says, where a kid has to first inhibit their first reaction to a particular command or stimulus, and then do a different action, she discusses like just how beneficial games like this are to a kid's developing brain and how they really set the foundation for all the other skills in life. In her study guide to this book, she specifically calls upon the reader to shift their understanding of developing focus and attention from passive models of emptiness into kind of playing these kind of games and actively practicing inhibitory control. If you want even more depth about this topic, you can check out the other video I made in this channel about what parents should understand about neural networks. You can see that in the description below, as this really is just such a fundamental and important shift in how we should think about helping our kids' brains develop. The students in that video who go shh are meant to represent inhibitory projections in a neural network. And so you can see in that video why playing games that develop like more neural patterns like that is just so important, that that understanding of the brain enables us to break down a lot of the challenge with kids' development and address things that would otherwise seem just unaddressable. Like, we often hear the quote, magic is just science that we don't understand yet. But I think children's like brain development is one of the most important fields to keep this idea in mind, because the inner workings of a child's brain are still very much magic to us. But if we really dig into the scientific research, we can start to get like the first glimmerings of understanding the kids' brains and unlocking all sorts of possibilities. Even the idea that there could be a connection between like the time you spend playing a game, like Simon Says, with a child and their ability to focus and have a calm temperament when they're older. There's a certain magic to that. But this book is just very much grounded in science, and the author talks about all sorts of studies that kind of underpin this. There's even one study where she says, quote, is launching to a study to determine if early childhood programs that foster development of executive functions can reduce the incidence or severity of ADHD. She predicts it can, end quote. So yeah, it's just really powerful what all of this research can do. And so the author ends the chapter with giving details about 19 concrete, just really well-informed suggestions that she has for breaking down and starting the development of kind of focus and self-control skills in very practical terms. So skill number 2, she calls perspective taking. And this is essentially the ability to say, okay, first, what do I believe about a given topic? And what conclusions do I come to because of that? Okay, now let me inhibit and put aside everything that I personally believe and think about what conclusions a different person would reach based on what they believe about the same topic. And then finally, let me hold both of those experiences in my mind at the same time and be able to weigh the two and think about what's reasonable, what's logical about each of the two perspectives without getting overwhelmed by either one of them. And one topic that's closely associated with this is empathy. But as the author talks about how empathy is really only a subset of perspective taking, and only when we deeply think about the skill of perspective taking as a whole can we actually think about how to teach it. Particularly if you've got a kid who's still developing their sense of self and other, if you just talk to them about a concept like empathy, rather than thinking of the larger practice of perspective taking, it can really backfire. In the graphic here, you can imagine a kid who's been taught the concept of empathy rather than developing the skill of perspective taking, who then just runs around screaming, hey, look at all these people who don't agree with me. They must be terrible at empathy. And there's plenty of other pitfalls that people who research empathy warn about how kind of just simplistic discussions of empathy with a kid, using kind of more popular notions of what that actually means, can really backfire. But the book here talks about just how many avenues of life a kid with strong perspective taking skills will enjoy. Um, some of the more obvious ones, just it's a key skill for things like a healthy marriage, healthy family life. But the book also talks about just how central it is to things like workplace success and really every endeavor in life. So, once again, with perspective taking, we have the super important skill that people naturally and intuitively recognize its value. But the author then asks, hey, why is this not more strongly emphasized in our education and curriculum? And why is this not at the forefront of people's minds when they think about the most important things for kids to be learning? And she then answers her question by talking about, as I just mentioned, how much more difficult it is to know how to teach and test perspective taking than, say, just telling a kid, like, hey, memorize all 50 states and their capitals, and, we'll just test you on your abilities, easily be able to grade that on 1 to 100. But perspective taking obviously just takes a bit more thought about how to do this. But the author then presents a lot of research about how perspective taking can actually be taught in really actionable ways. And she talks also about how it's really the key to a lot of behavior and aggression issues in kids. She gives the example of trying to teach kids the best ways to respond if they get kind of pushed or shoved by another kid. And she says, quote, when another child pushes another, the early thinking was that the children who responded aggressively to that push had an impoverished repertoire of options. They only knew how to push back or push harder, end quote. Yeah, basically thinking like, oh, you just need to teach them different ways to respond. They just don't know how to respond. And then as researchers looked into it more, it was actually less about having a big repository of options for how to respond, so much as being able to think about the mindset of the person who pushed them. So she says, quote, teachers using this approach to help children gain perspective of the situation realize that they don't have enough information to know why they were bumped and look for clues to understand whether this was an accident or a hostile act. Once you teach children this skill, Auer says, and then quoting within the quote, you've opened the gate to using their problem-solving skills, end internal quote. Larry Aber, and his colleagues have evaluated this approach with children in the New York public schools and have found that it works. Children become less aggressive, end quote. So again, with perspective taking, we're left with this super important skill, but one that's also a bit fuzzy and hard to know how to teach. And so often people just conclude it's kind of like just magic whether you end up to with a kid who's good or bad at perspective taking. But the author points to just a vast body of research demonstrating all the different modifications you can make to your everyday life and interactions that help develop this skill in kids over time. So this particular topic has just a lot of nuance to it, more so than the other Skittles and suggestions. So I'll leave some of the most important suggestions to the book to make sure I don't butcher any of those. But just as one example, the sixth one she talks about suggestions for how to improve this centers on trying to often ask your kids to imagine what somebody else is thinking about and what somebody else is likely feeling and what decision somebody else is likely to come to, given the information that they have available to them, even if that's different from the kids. So she says, quote, ask the older child to understand like a baby by saying things like internal quote, the baby is crying. Why do you think he's crying? Do you think he's hungry? Do you think he needs a diaper change? Hey, let's try to feed him and see if he stops crying it. End internal quote. Like had children who were, and the parents who did this, practice this, research demonstrated, had children who were more likely to get along and less likely to fight as they grew up. So yeah, just getting in the habit of kind of just always, whatever situations you're in, kind of asking like, hey, inhibit what you know. If you were only had access to the knowledge that the other person has, how do you think that they would respond? So that then leads into skill number three, which is communication. And she opens the chapter on communication by talking about how it's a skill that underlies just all other disciplines and workplace environments. She talks about a study where they were asking different employers what they value most and says, quote, we found remarkable uniformity in employers' top two concerns. Spoken communication skills was 29% of them, and written communication skills was 28% of them. Every other skill was mentioned by only a handful of employers, end quote. So again, most parents will recognize communication as a super important skill, but again, feel it's something that's so mysterious to try and talk to a child, particular ones who can't even speak yet, that they assume it's all just something eventually get taught in English classes later in life, whatnot. But the author talks about just how much research has been done into the way young children think about the world and try to communicate their thoughts with others, and offers just a lot of different perspectives than many adults might think. And based on that, she has just a number of great suggestions for how to give young children good foundations for developing communication skills later. And she encourages the common practice of just narrating a kid's life to them. She says, quote, think of yourself as a sports announcer, giving a play-by-play description of what is happening. Like, oh, you just woke up? Are you hungry? And one tweak to doing this with very young children that is backed by a lot of research she cites is try whenever possible to put the most important word at the end of your sentence, particularly if something that you can point to or communicate non-verbally in addition to what you're saying. So she gives an example of saying like, look, Anna, there's a bird, points to a bird. It's flying high in the sky, points to the sky. So in that case, like bird where you're pointing was the end of the first sentence, sky where you're pointing is the end of the second sentence, and it says as opposed to something like, hey, look, a bird, Anna, where you might be pointing to the bird, but you ended the sentence with the word Anna instead of the bird to just try and keep the last word of the sentence, the thing that you're focusing on, the new word you're teaching, the thing that you're pointing, not look at a bird, Anna. Um, so in general, she recommends just having lots of stories with kids, both stories from books and stories not from books, just things about like each other's lives, families' lives, whatever. So stories all around, lots of questions, lots of different forms of engagement about the stories. Um, she also emphasizes lots of opportunities to play games based on words and sounds. So, she gives an example like, hey, if Fred's name didn't have a F in it, what would it be? Oh, yeah, red. Can you think of another name that also sounds like a color? Just any of these kinds of games that you would play to think about words and sounds in different ways. Super important and gives a lot of the underpinnings of the research to how to think about these games. She also points out that you don't need to wait until your children can write to start developing their writing skills. She says, quote, "You can encourage writing long before your children know how to write by taking dictation from them," end quote. So skill number four is called making connections, and it has a lot to do with creativity. Because as we discussed at the very beginning of this video, how you group and categorize concepts can end up having profound impacts on how you think about that same information. And similarly for kids, being able to group and sort and make connections about all the ways in which different concepts or objects either are or are not related to each other is actually a fundamental skill that underpins a lot of their other learning. I can think more about that in the other video I have about neural networks. But basically, once again, like the author details just numerous studies showing just how foundational of a skill this is and how it's ultimately the basis of things like a kid's creativity and other skills that we value, but never fully know how to nurture. So, based on these studies, she points out some practices a lot of parents often do, but may not fully appreciate just how important it is to a child's development. Um, in particular, she talks about playing games that involve navigating through spaces, games like hide and seek or treasure hunts. One researcher, not in the book, but that I always found fascinating, is the work of Eleanor Oakes. She's an anthropologist who managed to become the sort of fly on the wall while various professors of physics were doing their work at UCLA. And after enough just hanging around with these physics professors doing their work, they began to just kind of ignore her and continue the way they normally would. And so she could start to then record and see how they came to like the key discoveries that they did in their work as physicists. And she noted that it was rarely during like sterile, quiet, focused times that they came up with their biggest discoveries. And instead, like they would be playing games with each other and they would often imagine the phenomenon they were studying actively moving around the room kind of essentially playing games and physical simulations of everything they were thinking. So it'd be like, hey, wait, I'm this kind of particle or something. That means that you're going to be pushed upwards. Okay, you jump on that chair. Okay, so now, oh, but that's going to mean that you're going to have to turn around. Oh, but that's going to force me to move here. So then I need to be the one on the chair. And it's like really embodied themselves, really moving through real world spaces. And that became kind of a key part of their creativity. So what's interesting about her work is that when she was trying to figure out how important the professors felt that this process was and if they should be teaching their students differently because of it, they would always first underrate its importance. But then when she would actually show them the records and be able to go back to them and say, like, hey, this is like what I saw, and they'd be like, oh, yeah, I guess all that stuff is really important. I guess kind of the embodied play is kind of key. Yeah, I guess it really is. So it's just super under appreciated, like how key this stuff is and she has plenty more research in the book about this kind of phenomenon. But then asks, how do we develop this spirit in children? And so the author talks about all the different times throughout the day when we have the opportunity to engage children to think about different spaces in the world. Things like while we're driving in the car, and we can simply ask questions like, hey, how many blocks until we get to your school? Okay, it's one, two, three, and four. Yeah, like, or hey, what do you think is going to be going on when we turn right at the next traffic light? What do you think we're going to see once that happens? Just, these kind of little questions can really get minds moving, and lots of important development can be kickstarted by them. And another key theme talked throughout this chapter is the importance of playing lots of board games, particularly ones with spinners and dice and moving number pieces. Lots of research showing just how beneficial these are. Yeah, lots of great studies. And so, ultimately, beyond just playing board games, to really develop like an amazing sense of creativity, she talks about some research into helping kids create their own card games and then playing that with them. And presumably the same applies to board games, where you're just giving kids this ultimate exercise in first creating abstract models of the world that they want to represent within their game, and then enumerating all the different parameters of that world and being able to explore and play out all the different permutations of that. Like when you put it together, it's really astounding what's going on in a child's head to be able to do that, and the skills that they're developing while you go through that process with them just could not possibly be understated. And so, lots of great other suggestions like this in the book for how to develop their sense of making connections and creativity. Okay, so skill five, she calls critical thinking. And this chapter has a good review of a lot of the different kind of logical fallacies, cognitive biases out there in the world. These are just really confusing and frustrating concepts for adults, but this chapter, the author does a great job explaining just how much more frustrating and confusing the world is to children who don't understand these concepts and all the problems and aberrant behaviors that can follow if children aren't explicitly helped to understand these. And she has a lot of great suggestions for how to talk to kids about them and just why it's so important. There's also just plenty of great YouTube videos out there going deep into cognitive bias, logical fallacies. I think pretty much anybody could benefit from reviewing those just for their own lives, but especially more so for parents. One additional suggestion she had for promoting critical thinking, besides reviewing logical fallacies, cognitive bias, was to have conversations with kids about just who's an expert in what and who isn't, which is somewhat of a curious suggestion at first. Like, but if you think about some of the like stereotype frustrations parents of high school students have, it's getting into scenarios like, hey, just because your friends are all eating Tide Pods doesn't mean it's a good idea. Like, how about reading what the CDC says too? Right? Stuff like that. It's a stereotype we have. Like, your friends all jumped off a bridge, and we kind of lament about it with older children. But the author points out that this is more of a general mindset and one that it's important to start promoting early in kids to always be asking and trying to identify like who out there has deeply thought sincerely about which issues and who's only done a superficial level. And then whenever a question comes up that could benefit from any particular expertise, like trying to always think through and identify like, hey, who would be the best possible person to answer this particular problem? And what would it take? Like, what effort would it we be able to do to seek that person out rather than just always being in the habit of asking just whoever is easiest and most convenient and nearby? So when you stop to think about this, it's perhaps seems obvious, but she does a good job pointing out like just how recognizing expertise really is a skill children need to be able to learn and develop and strengthen. Okay, so the second to last skill she calls taking on challenges. And this chapter deals with all the research on how kids react to stressful situations. Kind of what experiences create kids who are resilient, who will persevere and embrace challenges, and what experiences will leave kids just fearful and stagnant. And her first three suggestions all deal with parents needing to first learn how to just manage their own stress. Like she emphasizes a lot how if you don't find ways to manage your own stress, you're not going to be doing your kids any favors either. Which, the need to manage your own stress isn't in and of itself new information, but it's an important thing to keep in mind when we see all the parenting messages out there emphasizing like all the things that we need to do as parents and stay on top of so that our kids end up, like not unable to get into college and falling behind. Right. And whenever we get these kind of more guilt messages, we need to really investigate if the research that they're citing is actually true or if they're using kind of problematic generalizations and conclusions and potentially making things worse for both us and our children. So this is especially important to keep in mind if you watch the video in this channel about screen time. So anyway, after suggestions all around managing your own stress, for the first suggestion she has for kids is don't shield your children from everyday stresses, which sounds straightforward, but of course it's just heartbreaking in practice when we know how easily we can shield our kids from challenges, but we then instead need to work with them and be helping them develop the skills to cope with challenges. It's just so natural and easy for us to always want to focus on the positive, kind of bring optimism, reduce fear and worrying. And in contrast, it's just so difficult to then instead have to talk with them about confronting challenges. Yeah, it's something that both they and us would rather avoid and, can help them just bypass. But this chapter gives us a really good reminder of where following those natural tendencies can lead if we ever let our desire to comfort overpower our need to be truthful. So, how do we make sure challenges never end up getting just so overwhelming that we can't help but want to shield children from them? The research presented in this chapter discusses really the importance of creating just a family culture where we work with kids to anticipate and make their own plans for addressing challenges. And then, super important, the next step after that is after they've made their plans to anticipate their challenges, then create a culture where there's just regular reflection and holding themselves accountable for if they did indeed succeed in their plans, or if there were lessons that need to be learned in order to be more successful in future. Like, it's popular for adults to kind of romanticize this idea of always living in the moment, never worrying about the past or the future. But we have to keep in mind kids naturally do this to an extreme already. And it's actually super important to help them develop skills both to anticipate what's coming in the future and to be able to reflect on what's happened in the past and be able to learn from it. Two just extra super important skills. And so if we can do this successfully, it just heads off a whole host of patterns in adulthood that by that point are just too intractable to address. But, if we start in childhood developing these skills of planning, anticipation, reflection, we can head them off early. But it's a delicate thing to do correctly. Commonly, parents want to just reduce the idea of goal setting and accountability down to a simple practice like a sticker chart. And reducing a practice is important in this down to something like that. Has its own consequences. If you watch any of the videos on YouTube about intrinsic, extrinsic motivation, you can get more of a sense of that. But when you read through the research experiments in this chapter of Mind in the Making, they can be super helpful for just understanding the larger spirit that you need to have when you're creating this culture with your kids of planning, anticipation, execution, and then after that, reflection, self-accountability in a productive way. While I was reading through all of this and having all the research all in front of me so clearly lined up, one note I wanted to make for myself is about how all the different principles here are interrelated to one another, thinking about how natural it is for parents to always want to like both point out mistakes and shortcomings they find whenever there is like a clear plan and reflection space versus how natural it is to kind of gloss over and give sympathy for mistakes when they feel more like they were just accidents or weren't planned for or just kind of came as a matter of bad luck. Like, so to break that down more concretely, let's imagine you have a child who does a lot of the practices in that the research in this book points out is super important. Like, they make plans for what they want to do, they break those plans down into actionable steps, and at the end, they reflect on how well they accomplished what they set out for and what they need to improve. So let's, say that you have a conversation with this kid about cleanliness, and this kid is inspired by that goal. She says, like, yeah, I want to help out with cleanliness, and every day this week, I'm going to be the one to wipe down the table. And next week, we can reflect on how well I did. And kind of a week comes and goes. And then, like, it turns out, okay, only 2 out of the 7 nights did the kid actually help clean the table. Like, a very natural response to that kid is going to have a conversation around, like, hey, you said you were going to do 7 nights. You only did two. What happened to the other five? Which, yes, like, absolutely does need to be part of the conversation. And we shouldn't try and shield them from the fact that they totally missed their mark. But it's important that we never let the impulse to say, like, hey, you set a goal and you didn't meet it, from overshadowing recognizing like the larger importance of, hey, it's really great that you felt inspired to set a goal, then reflect and hold yourself accountable to it. That always needs to be the more important piece of the discussion. Because, if we don't keep that more important, the kid will very quickly switch to just not setting goals. Or if they do, they'll start focusing instead on like how to talk their way out of the accountability side of it and make you not like really think about the fact that they fell short of their mark and hadn't actually made the plan that they said or be able to talk about how all the circumstances that came up or how unlucky they were or just any other number of problematic patterns that can come if we start focusing on the wrong things. So, without being too extreme, reading through the research in this section, I kept it as a note for myself that I want to be more sympathetic when than might be the normal tendency when my son ultimately makes plans and reflects on how he failed at them. But, besides being more sympathetic when he does make plans, I think it would, be naive to think that this alone would avoid the pattern. So, more controversially, I think it's also important that when he complains about how unlucky he was, what bad circumstances he encountered, before being sympathetic to those kinds of arguments, I want to make sure that I'm inculcating a practice of checking if that was indeed the case, or if it was actually poor planning that kind of led him to be unprepared for the circumstances he encountered. Okay, so back to the next suggestions outlined in the book. ultimately, the goal of fostering intrinsic motivation is to encourage what is termed a growth mindset rather than a fixed mindset. These are terms you've probably heard about already. There's lots of videos on YouTube about them, and the book here goes into the origins of these terms and why they're so important. Um, it points out all the things that we may think of as being harmless or even beneficial, but are actually really dangerous to creating a growth mindset that we should inspire to. Most importantly, she points out the dangers of praising kids' abilities. She gives kind of this idea of giving out regular compliments to kids, saying things like, "Wow, what a beautiful painting. I can't believe what a talented artist you are." Like, for some people, the idea of hearing such nice, friendly, complimentary, uplifting praise, like the idea that that could be damaging to a child's well-being, like, can almost be like, "What? No." But there's lots of videos on YouTube, lots of research into this. It gives lots of details about its importance and how to be thoughtful in the praise that we give to children, and how it could ultimately lead to children who end up becoming stagnant and too afraid to take on new challenges in life. The author tends to take a somewhat milder view than some of the people in the videos on YouTube, but she does a great job enumerating kind of the research underlying it and helps people make their own decisions about just how mild or extreme they can want to be in thinking through like how to moderate their praise, and specifically on minimally trying to praise kids' effort rather than their talents or abilities. If you haven't already seen the videos on the screen, lots of good information about this topic. Okay, so the final skill she lists to cap off the most important fundamental skills for all the rest of a child's education rests upon teaching them to become self-directed and engaged learners. So, expanding what was said in the previous chapter, this chapter goes even further into research demonstrating how beneficial it is to, quote, help kids form and achieve goals by asking them to make plans, stick to them, and evaluate how the plans worked, end goal. So again, it sounds simple. Create a culture with your kids of first having them make plans for whatever it is they want to accomplish, and then afterwards reflecting on how it went. Easy enough, why not? But doing that well is its own just very nuanced dance, and thinking about all the research presented throughout the book is immensely helpful in doing it right. And she talks again about the importance of accountability, but how things like grades, which are basically just an evolution of sticker charts, are not really a good way of doing that. And so she talks about how kids who are self-directed learners want to learn just with every aspect of their being. They want to be engaged not just intellectually, but also emotionally, sensorily, socially, everything. And that one of the best things a parent can do to encourage this is to take the opportunity to like elaborate things and turn them into stories. Not to always think of discussions with your kids as kind of the most reduced and efficient, quickest dialogue you can have for any particular topic, but to instead, like, how can you turn things into interesting stories where rich characters are interacting to learn about different phenomena in ways that always are answering who, what, when, where, why, not just like the most basic reduced form you need, but really elaborating all of those out. And so finally, she closes by talking about how the children that really become self-directed engaged learners are the ones who, whenever they encounter a new concept, are always thinking not just kind of like a surface level basic understanding of it, but they really challenge themselves always to think, how would they explain that concept to somebody else? And so there's a pretty broad range of ways you can encourage this. And she's not super prescriptive in the book, but you can imagine this being as simple as posing a question like, "Hey, you just learned about such and such. Do you want to try explaining it to your favorite teddy bear? Like, how would you teach Teddy about this concept?" Or, the next level could be, "Hey, let's get on a call with grandma and tell her about like this new concept you learned. How would you explain it to her?" Or, more extreme, something a friend of mine does is, "Hey, let's create a YouTube channel so you can practice articulating, understanding what you read or learned about, along with kind of all your plans about how you want to apply it to your life," similar to how I'm doing here. So, these are all the seven skills that her research indicates form the primary foundation for a kid's early education, which in the example she points out, if you teach a kid to have a good inhibitory control, then we have good reason to believe that will lead them to have better mathematical thinking in life. But conversely, if you teach them mathematical reasoning, it doesn't mean they'll have great inhibitory control and all the other things that come from that. So that's why these are things that she lists as kind of the foundational skills that lead to everything else. And therefore, taking the time to reflect on how these 7 skills are being encountered in the activities in our children's lives or not, and all the modifications we can do to interacting with them throughout the day is super important. And so definitely check out the book to see all of the underlying research that underpins these 7 principles and be able to gain kind of your own intuitive understanding of how to apply them in your own child's life. Personally, after looking at all the research in here, I plan myself to kind of brush up on all the research again around intrinsic, extrinsic motivation, is it's super important. May potentially make another video about that. If you want to be informed of that, be sure to hit the subscribe button on the below this video and check out any of the other topics putting on this channel. Will be ones around screen time and also just understanding neural networks and why that's useful for parents.